Welcome to Chromatic Council Podcast, the podcast where law, leadership, and color collide. I'm your host, Carrie Heaps, and we have a great show lined up for you today. Just a few quick announcements. If you are licensed in Florida and also in Texas, I would love to have you join us for the Digital Tells How to Read Body Language on Zoom class. It's also a on-demand webinar if you can't attend live, but it is accredited here in Florida for 1.5 Tech and 1.5 General, and also in Texas for 1.25 MCLE. So if you're duly accredited in both of those states, I hope you will join us. Now, today I have a really great show lined up for you today. And today my guest is John Puls. He is a licensed psychotherapist and forensic expert witness. He specializes in wrongful death cases, that involve addiction treatment and mental health facilities, as well as involuntary commitment matters. Drawing on his clinical experience and forensic experience, John helps courts and counsel understand complex mental health issues where clinical care, standards of practice, and legal accountability intersect. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Carrie.
Absolutely. We are so glad that you are here with us today. And I'm loving having, we've been having more and more expert witnesses that have been coming on, and I think it just adds so much value to the show. I would love for you to tell our listening audience just a little bit more about you, and how did your clinical work as a psychotherapist evolve you into serving as a forensic expert witness? How did that kind of come about?
Absolutely. So I've worked in various levels of care and addiction treatments really since 2013, originally starting in a support staff role, so what's called a behavioral health technician. And during that time, I went back to undergraduate and graduate school and got my master's degree. And I continued working in the field during that time as a case manager, non-clinical roles essentially. And then
Mhm.
after I graduated, I worked for a pretty large dual diagnosis addiction treatment and mental health facility located in South Florida. And I was there for about 5 years. And eventually, what I started doing predominantly in that facility, along with clinical work, was what are called Marchman Act assessments. And so
Mhm.
the Marchman Act is a unique law in Florida for involuntary commitment for addiction specifically.
Mhm.
So it's just addiction. So there's a separate statute called the Baker Act, which is for mental health. And so we would get a lot of clients that were coming in that were Marchman Acted. And part of the Marchman Act process and the due process associated is that they have to be assessed by a qualified professional. So I started doing Marchman Act assessments, and I would have to give recommendations for levels of care for addiction treatment, length of stay, and justify it based on clinical criteria. And the respondent, so the person being Marchman Acted, part of the due process is they have an opportunity to contest the allegations in the petition as well as the assessment. So if they disagree with the recommendations, then they can contest it in court, and there will actually be a litigated hearing
Mhm.
where witnesses will testify. Each side will have an attorney, and I'll be cross-examined and directly examined on the stand based on what my assessments and recommendations are. So that was really my introduction into doing forensic work.
Mhm.
And it really helped me get comfortable in the courtroom, writing assessments, and helped me hone in on those skills. To when I eventually opened up my own practice and started doing different types of forensic work.
And I think it's always interesting how people kind of get into this line of being an expert witness. So, for the new expert witnesses out there, maybe they're forensic, maybe they're in another area of expertise. Do you see a common thread among mistakes that they're making when they first get in there that a professional like yourself would not be making? Like, if, or even words of advice for those that are listening that are like, hey, I've been wanting to do something like this too. What would be some words of wisdom you would share to say, hey, don't make these mistakes out the gate?
Sure. So, I mean, there are definitely things I learned along the way, but as far as what helped with my previous clinical skills was, what you document matters, right? So, what you write down matters, and that matters in clinical care outside of the courtroom, truly. And so I was always taught very clearly to be very intentional and clear and accurate with what you're documenting, and that can follow that person and that case for a very long time. And so I would say what happens with a lot of experts is that, they may write a report and assume that that's the end of it, right? But the
Mhm,
reality is that, opposing counsel is going to be reviewing that report. You could be deposed on that report
mhm.
soon or at a later date. Certainly, can come up in trial. So really, just having that experience of how much documentation matters, and really
Mhm.
recognizing that you're going on the record officially when you document it and you submit that report. I think that's just so critically important. And it may sound simple or something that should be obvious, but
Yeah.
until you're in that experience, it's a lot harder.
And I've always heard that too, just even in law in general, the devil's in the details. It's the I's that are not dotted and the T's that aren't crossed. That's where the cases are won and lost a lot of times. So, yeah, no, it's always good, I think, to bring it up. Now, in the wrongful death cases that you've worked with, the ones that have been tied to like addiction treatment or even mental health facilities, um, what issues come up most frequently that you see?
Yeah, so basically, for the vast majority of wrongful death cases, they usually fall into one of two categories. It's either an overdose, within the facility or shortly after leaving the facility, or a suicide. So those are really the two categories. Um, I've worked a few cases where there's been different types of injuries, sexual assaults within facilities or physical assaults of some kind. But
Mhm.
obviously, when it comes to the actual wrongful death cases, the vast majority, it's suicide or overdose death.
And what do you find like for common errors or maybe even oversights for, I guess, maybe the facilities that lead to like those legal exposure in involuntary commitment cases? What are you seeing there?
Sure. So I would put it into three categories. So it's a combination of assessment, and that's assessment for suicide risk, making sure the person is properly searched so that there's no substances attempted being, to be brought into the facility.
Mhm,
Suicide risk assessments, both at admission and at discharge. And then also observation
mhm,
within the facility. So there are different cues, is what they're called, or certain, times and frequency that you're supposed to check on a person depending on their level of risk. So that person could be on Q30s, which is that somebody has to observe them every 30 minutes. They could be on Q15s if they're higher risk. So that's every 15 minutes, or they could be on a one-to-one. So there's a lot of oversights I see where people are either categorized wrong or the checks aren't being completed.
mhm,
And then the third part is discharge planning. So a lot of times people will try to leave facilities against medical advice for various reasons. They don't want to be there anymore, or people will be administratively discharged
mhm,
from a mental health or addiction facility, either due to payment, insurance issues, could be due to some behavioral issues, right?
mhm.
And, there's still a responsibility on the facility to ensure a safe discharge plan, to make sure that they're properly assessed for suicide risk, that they're going to a level of care that is appropriate. So it's assessment,
Mhm.
observation, and discharge, what I would say are the three main areas.
Do you find that some of that is happening because maybe the facilities are not um, they don't have enough help on staff, or do you think it's because sometimes they are not trained properly? And the reason I ask is I actually was speaking with a colleague of mine who has been dealing with more, not a nursing facility, but more of a higher level, like memory care facility. And that was their main thing. It's just there's not enough people. There's not enough people to work there. Are you finding kind of the same thing with a lot of the institutions and mental health facilities that you deal with?
Sure. Yeah. So it often does come down to staffing issues.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of different types of staff in these facilities. So there's what I like to call support staff. So those are like the behavioral health technicians. Those are the people that are checking people into programs. They're facilitating drug tests. They're the ones that are doing the Q checks So, they go around either in a digital app or a clipboard, and they're actually observing the person. So if they don't have enough behavioral health techs, they can't complete those tasks and they
Mhm.
can't observe people properly. So that's certainly an issue. And then, of course, there's like nursing, medical, and then clinical psychotherapist shortages,
Mhm.
where people may not be getting properly assessed or having proper discharge planning.
Okay.
For example, most facilities should have what's called a case manager, and a case manager is often in charge, and this can kind of be a dual role with the therapist as well, but they're often in charge of discharge planning. And so what that looks like is making sure the person is set up with an appropriate aftercare plan, they're being connected to resources. And so if that doesn't happen, there can often be pitfalls.
Mhm. And I want to talk to you about attorneys because, from your experience, what do you think strong attorneys do differently when working with an expert witness? I think part of this is probably that they're working with an expert witness. From the other expert witnesses that we've had on the show, sometimes I guess attorneys don't always want to work with someone from the outside, an expert witness. Do you find that as well? Is that been your experience?
Yes, it definitely has been my experience. And I was smiling there because I'm just thinking about, some of the good attorneys that I've worked with, and some of the not so good experiences that I've had. And I mean, listen, working with an expert can be difficult. There's an expense associated with it. So, in most of these cases, on the plaintiff side, there's all the front end expenses. On the defense side, the insurance carriers having to pay for additional expenses. So it can be difficult. And I totally understand that, especially if an expert is saying something, which is often the case, that is maybe not so favorable for the particular attorney.
Mhm.
Um, but I would say the good attorneys that I work with, first of all, are receptive to feedback from somebody that's in an area of expertise or unfamiliar with. What's
Mhm.
interesting is that for me at least, most of the cases that I work, they're not incredibly common. This is a very niche area, right? So
Mhm.
wrongful death cases involving an addiction treatment facility or mental health facility that is not actually a medical malpractice case are much less common, right?
Mhm.
So most attorneys that I've worked with, it may be the first time ever that they've either been on the plaintiff side or been defending a case like this. So there's a steeper learning curve as opposed to, let's say, nursing home negligence or, negligence happening in an emergency room, which is probably more common. And this is not a common experience for a lot of attorneys. So there's a steeper learning curve. The ones that are really good that I've worked with, they're receptive to feedback. They give the expert enough time. So
Mhm.
I get those calls where I can tell the attorney's drinking from a fire hose, right, or attempting to, and they're up against a really big deadline. They should have secured an expert long before this, and that they're also providing the records associated in the case in a very succinct and clear way, and that the records are complete.
Mhm.
That's really important.
Yeah, of course. And when you do get hired for a case, how do you typically translate complex psychological concepts that, are second nature to you, but where they can resonate clearly with the judge and with juries?
Yeah, so I mean that is arguably the most important skill of an expert is to be able to explain this in a way that somebody that has no prior knowledge of addiction treatment facilities, mental health facilities, operational standards, suicide risk, overdose, different standards associated that license these different facilities in a very clear and simple way. So what I do often is I use a lot of analogies,
Mhm.
right? Um, and that are kind of simpler and easier to understand. And I also break it down and explain the why behind the policy, right? So it's one thing to say like, okay, this is what a proper suicide risk assessment looks like. It's a whole nother thing to explain the purpose of it. So this is the
Mhm.
purpose of it, and this is why it matters, right? It's one thing to
Mhm.
say that okay, the suicide risk assessment wasn't done properly, the safety planning wasn't done properly. It's a whole nother thing to actually break down and explain exactly the purpose behind it. So, in short, I try and make it as simple as possible. I explain the purpose behind it and I use analogies.
Yeah. And I find too, I think that's always the more, because sometimes too, same thing. I think even attorneys can sometimes be guilty of this. They think everybody went to law school with them, where they're trying to
Right.
explain certain things and they're just not realizing that, hey, this is a layperson, they don't get it. Now, obviously, since the show is called Chromatic Counsel, I always love to ask all of my guests, whenever you're testifying, or you have to go to court, whether it's virtual or in person, are you conscious of color, like color in your wardrobe, like what you're wearing, or even with courtroom visuals? Because do you find color plays a little bit of a role sometimes when you're trying to um, bring a point home, per se?
Oh yeah, so I completely agree. So I mean, both appearance and what you're actually wearing. Obviously, I'm more casual today, but I would not wear this to court. So, and what you wear and the colors really do matter, right? I tend to think of like, what is not like a very threatening color, what's less intense, what's more calming,
Hmm.
and not distracting, right?
Hmm.
So, and so what I typically like, I'm not going to wear like an all black suit or anything like that because that is like it's kind of like dark and gloomy. At the same time, I'm not going to wear a really brightly colored suit or a brightly colored tie. I tend to feel that grays and darker blues are a little more calming and less intense. So that's typically what I go for.
Yeah, and I had a feeling you were going to say gray. I kind of had that
Yeah.
feeling, and I love gray. I think you're right. I mean, I always tell people, I'm like, if you don't have a blue suit, I would go with a gray would be the next choice because you're right. Black can be not just gloomy, but sometimes it can be a little bit more intimidating, I find, for
Yes.
those types of situations. So if you could give attorneys that are listening to the show one piece of advice when handling cases involving mental health experts, what would it be and why? And if you have more than one, you're welcome to share that. But I was kind of looking for one key piece.
Sure. So, what I would recommend, and again, acknowledging that I don't think the cases involving mental health, especially when you look at the personal injury, wrongful death cases, they're not as common.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first piece of advice I would say is, be willing to spend some extra time educating yourself on the subject, whether
Mm-hmm.
that is through the expert or, some type of continuing education, general research articles, something like that. So, just be willing to spend some more time bringing yourself into that world because it is a very unique and distinct world when you compare it to other types of healthcare. So that's the main thing. And the other thing to know too is, and attorneys don't often like this, and I can understand why, is they want like things that are really definitive, right? And especially in like wrongful death cases, right? And the unfortunate reality is that often, and this isn't sometimes things are very definitive depending on the case, but there's some nuance
Mm-hmm.
to different situations, right? And especially when it comes to mental health, if you have a physical injury of some kind, you have a, broken wrist or something, there's, it's probably different ways you can heal it, but it's ultimately the same path. When it comes to something complex like suicide risk, right? There's a lot of details and a lot of nuances. And so just to kind of get comfortable with that aspect of it.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you brought that up too, because as a CLE provider myself, I always look to see like what's out there, what are the competitor, what does Lawline have as far as, just looking through, not that I can teach this, but I think it's always a great idea too. And you're right, like if they can do continuing legal ed and include this as a section, because it fills the requirements, but it's also going to give them a much better grasp on what they're going to be dealing with. Do you do any continuing
Uh,
legal ed as an expert witness?
so I participated in some like with attorneys. For example, Florida's involuntary commitment laws, the
Mm-hmm.
Marchman Act, the Baker Act, and then our guardianship statute. I've co-presented with some attorneys for CLEs
Mm-hmm.
in that, and that's because somebody could be a practicing attorney in this area for 20 years and have virtually no familiarity with Baker Acts or Marchman Acts. They're aware of those statutes, but if
Mm-hmm.
they get a case, even a wrongful death case, there was a very I don't know, not necessarily higher profile, but it was more in the media, and it was actually, it was dismissed at summary judgment, and then the summary judgment was overturned in the appellate court actually, and it was all involving the Marchman Act, right? And
Mhm.
so I would imagine that attorney on the plaintiff side really had to do a lot of research on the Marchman Act, and unless they were familiar with it, and there are specific CLEs in Florida, at least, for those types of laws.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was just curious if you did that. And John, do you have anything coming up or anything at all that you'd like to share with our listening audience? I'm going to have a link in the show notes so they can go directly to your site and check that out more. But did you have anything that you'd like to share with everyone in closing?
So I don't have any presentations or virtual or anything like that coming up very soon. So nothing else I would want to share other than I still have a very active clinical practice. So that my expert witness work is um, not the bulk of what I do, but I do really enjoy doing it, and so I do have a very active clinical practice as well.
Awesome. Well, wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to take a moment out of your day to join us on the show. And like I said, for anyone who's listening that wants to get in touch with John, there is a link in the show notes below. So you can go directly to his website to connect directly to him. And again, John, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And that is a wrap for this episode of Chromatic Counsel. If what John shared resonates with you, helps you in any way, I hope you will click the like button, click on subscribe so you know when we drop our latest episode of Chromatic Counsel, and I hope you can tune in next time.